Contextual Reality. Chapter 1. A World Without Inherent Meaning. Why objects and events do not carry meaning by themselves. Human beings are accustomed to perceiving the surrounding world as a collection of things that already possess a certain meaning. Money appears valuable, a flag seems to be an important symbol, a high-ranking position is regarded as a sign of success, and various actions are considered right or wrong. However, upon closer examination, it becomes clear that objects and events themselves contain no inherent meaning. A stone does not know that it is a stone. A piece of paper is unaware that people call it money. A sequence of sounds possesses no meaning until someone's brain connects it to specific concepts. In physical reality, there are only particles, fields, chemical reactions, and processes that occur independently of human interpretations. Meaning arises not within the object itself, but within the system of relationships between the object, the observer, and the surrounding environment. The same phenomenon may be perceived in entirely different ways depending on culture, historical period, level of knowledge, and personal experience. A gold ring may be jewelry, a symbol of marriage, an investment asset, or simply a certain amount of metal. A forest may represent a source of timber, a place for recreation, sacred land, or a complex ecosystem. The object itself remains the same, while its meaning changes together with the context. The world does not tell people how they should understand what is happening. Meaning is not discovered in a finished form. It is created through interpretation. How human beings transform facts into interpretations. The brain does not perceive reality directly. It continuously transforms an immense stream of signals into a coherent picture of the world. Light reaching the retina, the pressure of sound waves, chemicals acting on receptors, and countless other signals pass through a complex processing system. At every stage of this process, information is selected, simplified, and supplemented. Human beings do not merely register facts. They automatically answer questions such as, what is this? How important is it? What threat or benefit does it represent? How should one respond? Facts alone rarely determine behavior. Their interpretation is far more important. Two people may encounter the same event and arrive at completely opposite conclusions. Losing a job may be perceived as a catastrophe, an opportunity to change one's life, or a predictable consequence of previous decisions. Criticism may be understood as an attack, assistance, or a sign of indifference. What changes is not the event itself, but the model of the world through which a person views it. Interpretations are shaped by language, upbringing, education, cultural environment, emotions, social affiliations, and accumulated experience. This is why different societies can construct entirely different systems of values based on the same physical reality. Human beings live not among facts, but among their explanations. The difference between reality and its description. One of the fundamental characteristics of human thinking is the tendency to equate the description of the world with the world itself. People often forget that concepts, theories, ideologies, and scientific models are merely tools for understanding reality rather than exact copies of it. The map is not the territory. A formula is not nature. A constitution is not the state. The word tree does not contain wood, leaves, or roots. Every description inevitably simplifies reality and discards part of the information. Even the most precise scientific models are approximations. They allow us to predict the behavior of systems under certain conditions, but they do not provide an exhaustive answer to the question of what reality itself truly is. The same object can be described at different levels. A human being is simultaneously a collection of atoms, a biological organism, a bearer of consciousness, a participant in social relationships, and an economic actor. None of these descriptions is entirely false or entirely complete. Understanding this distinction changes one's attitude toward personal beliefs. Any worldview turns out not to be an ultimate truth, but a working model whose usefulness is determined by its ability to explain events, predict consequences, and account for the necessary context. Reality exists independently of descriptions, yet human beings can access it only through them. This is precisely why expanding context and reconsidering interpretations are not a rejection of understanding the world, but the only way to come closer to it. Chapter 2. Interpretation as a Tool for Survival. Why evolution did not require an objective picture of the world. It is easy for people to assume that their senses and cognitive abilities were created by nature in order to achieve an accurate understanding of reality. However, from an evolutionary perspective, the task of living organisms has never been to seek truth. Their primary goal has always been survival and reproduction. Natural selection does not evaluate how accurately a creature understands the structure of the universe. It tests only one thing: whether a particular pattern of behavior helps the organism stay alive long enough to pass its genes on to the next generation. If a certain interpretation of the world increases the chances of survival, it may become firmly established, even if it is far removed from an objective picture of reality. An organism that mistakenly interprets a rustling sound in the bushes as a predator will sometimes waste energy by fleeing unnecessarily. But an organism that spends too much time analyzing the situation in search of truth may fail to escape at all. For this reason, human perception evolved as a system of rapid and practical approximations. The brain constantly simplifies reality, identifies significant patterns, and ignores vast amounts of information that are not directly relevant to survival. Most of the processes occurring around human beings remain invisible to them. People do not perceive electromagnetic waves, notice the movement of tectonic plates, observe individual molecules, or intuitively understand quantum phenomena. The picture of the world that humans consider self-evident is merely a narrow fragment of reality selected by evolution. Objectivity has never been a necessary condition for existence. What proved far more important was the creation of a sufficiently useful illusion that allows effective action within a particular environment. Utility is more important than absolute truth. In many situations, the value of an idea is determined not by whether it represents an ultimate truth, but by how well it fulfills its function. For thousands of years, people relied on models of the world that, from a modern perspective, were inaccurate or even incorrect. Sailors navigated by the stars without understanding the nature of gravity. Farmers successfully cultivated crops without knowing anything about genetics. Physicians treated diseases long before the discovery of bacteria and viruses. These forms of knowledge were not completely true, yet they remained sufficiently effective for solving specific problems. Even modern science advances not by discovering final answers, but by continually creating increasingly useful models. Theories replace one another not because previous theories were entirely useless, but because new ones explain more phenomena and make more accurate predictions. The same process occurs in everyday life. People evaluate the world around them through a set of practical simplifications. They trust familiar faces, recognize danger through indirect signs, form concepts of good and evil, and build social relationships. These mechanisms do not guarantee objectivity, but they enable rapid decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Absolute truth may exist independently of human beings, yet biological intelligence must operate under conditions of limited time, limited information, and limited computational resources. In such a system, the advantage belongs not to the one who knows everything, but to the one whose models prove to be the most useful. The brain as a system for constructing working models. It often seems as though the brain functions as a device for recording the surrounding world. In reality, its role is far more complex. Rather than copying reality, it continuously constructs internal models of it. Every second, the senses transmit enormous amounts of data, yet consciousness receives only a small portion of the processed information. The brain selects important signals, connects them with previous experience, predicts consequences, and creates a simplified picture of what is happening. This picture is constantly updated. When expectations match the outcome, the model is reinforced. When reality contradicts predictions, the brain is forced to revise its assumptions. In essence, human beings live within a system of hypotheses that are continuously tested in practice. Many things appear self-evident only because the corresponding models have functioned successfully for a long time. Even fundamental categories, space, time, identity, social status, justice, and morality, are not direct reflections of reality, but ways of organizing experience and increasing the efficiency of behavior. The development of intelligence can be viewed as the gradual refinement of these models. A child constructs simple explanations of events, an adult is capable of considering a greater number of factors, and scientific thinking creates models that extend far beyond immediate experience. Yet no model is final. Every understanding of the world remains a temporary construction, useful only as long as it allows successful navigation through reality. From the perspective of evolution, this is precisely the primary criterion of its value. Chapter 3. Context creates meaning. The same fact in different frames of reference. People often assume that facts exist independently of interpretation and speak for themselves. However, the same fact can acquire entirely different meanings depending on the frame of reference in which it is considered. The fall of a tree in a forest is a physical event associated with gravity and the breakdown of the tree's structure. For a biologist, it is part of the life cycle of an ecosystem. For an entrepreneur, it is either the loss of a resource or, conversely, a source of raw material. For a tourist, it is an obstacle on the path. For an animal living nearby, it is a change in habitat. The event itself remains unchanged. Only the way it is described changes. The same is true in human society. Rising prices may be viewed as an economic problem, an inevitable consequence of political decisions, an opportunity for profit, or a temporary inconvenience. The very same action may be considered heroic, illegal, or simply part of someone's job, depending on who is evaluating the situation. Even concepts such as success, justice, freedom, and dignity do not possess universal content. Their meaning is formed within specific systems of beliefs, values, and goals. Human beings rarely encounter pure facts. Almost always, they deal with facts that have already been placed within a particular frame of reference. The influence of culture, history, and environment. Most ideas about the world are formed long before a person begins to analyze events independently. Language, traditions, education, family, and social institutions gradually create a set of interpretations that eventually come to be perceived as natural and self-evident. What is considered normal in one society may be regarded as strange or even threatening in another. Different cultures approach family, property, religion, authority, personal freedom, and the distribution of responsibilities in different ways. These differences arise not because physical reality changes, but because different communities construct different systems of meaning around it. History also shapes the way people understand the present. A society that has experienced war, economic crisis, or technological transformation develops distinctive values and modes of thinking. Some generations tend to value stability, others change, and still others personal independence. The environment in which a person lives reinforces certain interpretations on a daily basis. A child raised in a large city will perceive the world differently from someone who spent their childhood in the countryside. People surrounded by competition begin to evaluate success and failure differently from those who grew up in conditions of collective cooperation. Many beliefs appear to be personal choices only because people rarely notice the influence of the historical and cultural processes that shape their worldview. How meaning changes as context expands. The broader the context in which a phenomenon is examined, the more its meaning may change. What initially seemed obvious can begin to look entirely different once new factors are taken into account. A person's behavior may be explained by laziness, a lack of discipline, or poor character. However, a broader context may include exhaustion, economic circumstances, upbringing, health, environmental pressures, and the characteristics of the brain itself. As a result, the original interpretation changes. Historical events also acquire new meanings when the scale of analysis expands. Wars, crises, and revolutions rarely emerge from a single cause. Behind every major event usually lies a complex interplay of economic interests, technological changes, demographic processes, cultural conflicts, and chance circumstances. Even a person's attitude toward themselves depends on the context they use. From a narrow perspective, failure may appear to be a personal catastrophe. From a broader one, it may be seen as a natural stage of learning, a consequence of environmental constraints, or an insignificant episode in a long chain of events. However, expanding context does not guarantee ultimate understanding. Each new level of analysis reveals additional questions and demonstrates how conditional previous explanations were. Understanding the world is not a search for a single correct interpretation, but a continual expansion of the boundaries of the context within which that interpretation exists. The more factors a person is able to consider simultaneously, the more difficult it becomes to believe in simple and final answers. Chapter 4: Narrow Context as a Source of Errors. Why people reach opposite conclusions. People are often surprised that, when presented with the same facts, they can arrive at completely opposite conclusions. Some consider a certain event a sign of progress, while others see it as evidence of decline. Some view a particular decision as salvation, while others perceive it as a threat. At first glance, this appears to be the result of a lack of information or someone's incompetence, yet the underlying cause is often much deeper. Every person views events through their own set of contexts. These contexts are shaped by upbringing, education, culture, life experience, social environment, and personal interests. The same fact becomes embedded into different systems of explanation, each of which highlights certain details while ignoring others. An economist may explain rising crime rates through changes in income levels and employment. A psychologist may focus on behavioral patterns and personality development. A politician may emphasize legislation and governance. A biologist may examine the influence of genetics and environment. None of these perspectives is necessarily entirely wrong, yet each captures only part of the overall picture. The problem lies not in the existence of different interpretations, but in the tendency of people to consider their own frame of reference the only correct one. The narrower the context being used, the more likely alternative explanations are to be perceived not as additions, but as threats. Most disagreements arise not because of the facts themselves, but because of differences in the models through which those facts are interpreted. The trap of a single discipline. Every field of knowledge creates its own language, methods, and systems of explanation. This allows researchers to deeply examine specific aspects of reality, but at the same time creates the risk of falling into the trap of a single discipline. A person accustomed to viewing the world through one intellectual framework gradually begins to see everything through that lens. An economist starts explaining human behavior exclusively through incentives and benefits. A psychologist reduces events to internal experiences and cognitive mechanisms. A biologist searches for evolutionary causes, while an engineer attempts to represent society as a set of technical processes. Such an approach creates an illusion of understanding. A single discipline can indeed provide accurate answers within its own domain, yet complex phenomena almost never obey the laws of only one field of study. Human society cannot be fully explained through biology alone, just as economic processes cannot be reduced exclusively to psychology. Political decisions depend on history, culture influences economics, technology transforms social relationships, and individual behavior is shaped by multiple factors simultaneously. Specialization is essential for the development of knowledge, but turning one discipline into a universal key for understanding the world inevitably leads to a distorted picture of reality. The more complex the object of study, the more dangerous the attempt to explain it using the tools of only one area of knowledge. The consequences of simplified explanations. Simplification is a natural function of human thinking. Without it, people would be unable to make quick decisions and navigate the surrounding world. However, excessive simplification often becomes a source of serious errors. Human beings tend to search for simple causes behind complex events. An economic crisis may be explained by the actions of individual politicians. Social conflicts may be attributed to the moral qualities of specific groups. Personal success or failure may be explained solely by hard work or the lack of it. Such explanations are attractive because of their clarity. They create a sense of control and allow people to quickly divide the world into understandable categories. Yet the more complex a system is, the less likely it is that its behavior is determined by a single factor. Simplified models can influence not only individual thinking but entire societies. Political slogans, Ideological structures and mass stereotypes are often built precisely by reducing complex reality to a few emotionally understandable patterns. As a result, people begin fighting not against the causes of problems, but against their simplified representations. Instead of analyzing systemic processes, they search for someone to blame. Instead of studying interconnections, they believe in universal solutions. A narrow context makes the world easier to understand, but at the same time hides a significant part of the causes and consequences. The more confident a person becomes in the simplicity of their own explanation, the more likely it is that reality is far more complex than it appears. Chapter 5: The Hierarchy of Descriptions of Reality. The physical level. Any phenomenon encountered by human beings can be examined simultaneously at several different levels. The most fundamental of these is the physical level, the world of particles, fields, energy, and interactions governed by the laws of nature. At this level, humans are not fundamentally different from a star, a stone, or a drop of water. The human body consists of atoms, molecules, and chemical compounds that continuously participate in complex physical processes. The beating of the heart, the transmission of nerve impulses, and the movement of muscles ultimately reduce to the movement of matter and energy. Physical description attempts to answer the question, what is the world made of, and according to what laws does it function? However, despite its fundamental nature, this level says almost nothing about love, fear, power, morality, or culture. A complete physical description of a human being would not explain why they experience jealousy, create states, or write books. For that, other levels of analysis are required. The biological level. If physics describes the building blocks of reality, biology examines the ways these components are organized into living systems. At the biological level, humans appear as the result of billions of years of evolution. Their bodies, senses, emotions, and behavioral mechanisms developed not for discovering truth or achieving happiness, but for increasing the probability of survival and reproduction. Hunger motivates the search for food. Fear helps avoid danger. Attachment strengthens social bonds. Curiosity encourages exploration of the environment. Even many complex forms of behavior are closely connected to tasks that ancient organisms solved long before the emergence of civilization. The biological level explains why different species possess different ways of perceiving the world and why human thinking has many limitations. However, it also cannot fully describe reality. Knowledge of the structure of the brain cannot directly produce laws, moral principles, or political systems. The psychological level. The next level is psychology, the field where biological mechanisms are transformed into experiences, thoughts, desires, and personal reality. At this level, concepts such as personality, memory, motivation, beliefs, and self-perception emerge. Human beings are no longer viewed merely as collections of cells and organs, but as carriers of a subjective inner world. The same event may produce opposite reactions in different people precisely because each person has their own experiences, system of associations, and unique history of interaction with the surrounding environment. The psychological level demonstrates that perception of the world is not a passive reflection of reality. The brain constantly completes the picture of what is happening, creates expectations, identifies significant objects, and interprets incoming signals. However, even a detailed understanding of an individual's psychology cannot fully explain society. For that, the next level is required. The social level. Human beings do not exist in isolation, but within a complex network of relationships with other people. The social level describes the rules, norms, and structures that emerge as a result of collective interaction. At this level, concepts such as family, state, religion, traditions, language, education, and culture appear. Many phenomena that seem natural exist only because millions of people simultaneously maintain the same interpretations. Money has value only because of social agreement. Laws function only because people recognize their authority. Reputation, status, and prestige have no physical form, yet they can influence behavior more strongly than many material factors. The social level demonstrates that a significant part of human reality is created through collective imagination. People live not only among objects, but also among agreements, symbols, and shared concepts. At the same time, society cannot be reduced entirely to the psychology of individuals. Once millions of individuals begin interacting with one another, new patterns emerge that cannot be discovered at previous levels of analysis. The economic and political levels. The largest systems of human organization appear in economics and politics. Here, individual desires, biological needs, and social norms are transformed into institutions, resource distribution systems, and struggles for influence. The economic level examines production, exchange, consumption, and methods of distributing limited resources. The political level determines who makes decisions, how rules are established, and how different groups compete for power. The same event can appear completely different depending on the scale of analysis chosen. The closure of a company may mean the loss of employment for one person, a change in strategy for the company, an economic indicator for the state, and a source of social tension for politicians. At these levels, it becomes especially clear how conditional many human constructions are. Borders between states, financial systems, ideologies, and political institutions do not exist independently of people. They are maintained through collective belief, historical circumstances, and complex mechanisms of coordination. No level of description replaces the others. A human being is simultaneously a physical object, a biological organism, a carrier of a mind, a participant in society, and an element within economic and political processes. Understanding reality requires not choosing between these descriptions, but the ability to see their interconnection and shift between different scales of analysis. Chapter 6. Efficiency versus Truth. What makes an interpretation useful? People often evaluate ideas from the perspective of their truthfulness, asking how accurately a particular theory reflects reality. However, in everyday life and even in science, another question is equally important. How well does this interpretation actually work? A useful interpretation does not have to be perfectly accurate. Its primary function is to help people navigate the world, make decisions, and predict the consequences of their actions. This is why many ideas remain in use for centuries despite their incomplete correspondence with reality. A city map never reproduces every detail of the landscape, yet it remains useful if it allows a person to reach a desired destination. Economic models cannot account for every aspect of human behavior, but they help predict certain trends. Even everyday assumptions about people are simplifications that allow faster decision-making in a complex social environment. The usefulness of an interpretation is determined not by its elegance or by the confidence of its supporters, but by how successfully it fulfills its purpose. A good model allows us to explain what is happening, predict the development of events, adapt to changes, find solutions to new problems, combine separate facts into a unified system. The broader the area of application of a model and the higher its predictive ability, the greater its value becomes. Why the most beautiful theories can be useless. The human brain is drawn to simple, coherent, and emotionally appealing explanations. People enjoy believing in theories that offer a clear picture of the world, divide events into good and evil, and promise universal answers to complex questions. However, the beauty of an idea does not guarantee its effectiveness. History is filled with concepts that appeared logical and convincing, but failed to adequately explain reality. Many philosophical systems, political ideologies, and social theories were built upon several elegant principles, yet encountered difficulties as soon as they attempted to describe complex human behavior. Models that explain everything through a single cause are especially attractive. Some reduce history entirely to economics, others to biology, and others to morality or politics. Such constructions create a sense of order, but often ignore a vast number of contributing factors. Beautiful theories can be ineffective for several reasons. First, they are often too abstract and do not allow for making concrete predictions. Second, they may work only under a limited set of conditions, while their supporters continue applying them everywhere. Third, some ideas correspond so well with human expectations that people stop noticing facts that contradict them. Reality does not have to be simple, symmetrical, or convenient for human understanding. Sometimes a less elegant model proves far more useful precisely because it accounts for the complexity of the world more effectively. Criteria for an effective model of the world. If absolute truth is unattainable, a question arises: by what criteria can the quality of our own views of the world be evaluated? One of the most important criteria is predictive ability. The more accurately a model allows us to forecast the consequences of events, the more likely it is that it reflects important patterns of reality. Equally important is the ability of a model to adapt to new information. Any interpretation that requires ignoring facts that contradict it gradually loses its connection with reality. An effective worldview must change as knowledge expands. Another criterion is the scope of applicability. Some models work only under narrow circumstances, while others remain useful across many different situations. The more context an interpretation can encompass, the greater its value. Simplicity is also important. A model must be complex enough to describe the essential aspects of reality, yet simple enough to remain understandable and practical. Excessive detail can be just as useless as excessive simplification. Finally, an effective model must allow for the possibility of being wrong. Recognizing the limitations of any description of the world does not make a person less confident in their actions. On the contrary, it allows them to notice inaccuracies more quickly and adjust their understanding. From the perspective of survival and development, the value of an idea is determined not by how convincing it sounds, but by how effectively it helps interact with reality. Truth may remain an unreachable ideal, but efficiency shows the direction in which one should move. Chapter 7. The breadth of context and the limits of understanding. Why expanding the worldview increases accuracy. The more factors a person is able to consider simultaneously, the more accurate their understanding of events becomes. A narrow context allows for quick decisions, but it often leads to mistakes because it excludes a significant part of the causes and connections involved. Many phenomena appear simple only as long as they are viewed in isolation. An economic crisis cannot be fully explained by the actions of individual politicians. Human behavior cannot be reduced solely to personality traits. The success of a company depends not only on the quality of its product, but also on market conditions, technology, culture, legislation, and countless other factors. Expanding context allows us to see that events rarely have a single cause. Behind every decision, conflict, or achievement, there is usually a complex interaction of biological, psychological, social, historical, and economic processes. This is why the development of science has been accompanied by a constant increase in the complexity of our understanding of the world. Humanity gradually moved away from simple explanations, replacing them with models that accounted for an increasing number of variables. Planets stopped being understood as revolving around the Earth, diseases stopped being viewed as punishments from higher powers, and human behavior stopped being explained solely through the moral qualities of an individual. Expanding context does not make the world simpler. It makes our understanding of it more accurate. However, increasing the amount of information does not always lead to better understanding. The cost of excessive complexity. If excessive simplification distorts reality, excessive complexity can make it practically impossible to analyze. Theoretically, any event can be described in infinitely great detail. To fully explain an ordinary conversation between two people, one would have to consider the structure of their nervous systems, their upbringing, economic circumstances, cultural environment, relationship history, climate, level of fatigue, health conditions, and thousands of other factors. The problem is that human intelligence has limited computational capacity. The more variables are included in a model, the more difficult it becomes to identify which of them are truly significant. Excessive complexity creates several problems. First, an enormous amount of detail makes decision-making more difficult. A person may become so absorbed in searching for additional explanations that they lose the ability to act. Second, complex models become difficult to test. If a theory is capable of explaining absolutely any possible outcome, it gradually stops making meaningful predictions. Third, an excessive number of factors can create an illusion of deep understanding. Sometimes a long and complicated explanation merely hides the absence of a clear structure. An effective model of the world must be detailed enough to reflect important patterns, while remaining practical and usable. Where the boundary of necessary context lies. There is no universal amount of information that is sufficient for understanding every situation. The required breadth of context always depends on the task at hand. Repairing a car usually does not require deep knowledge of molecular physics. Understanding the plot of a novel does not require analyzing the author's neural activity. Treating a disease requires a physician to focus more on biological mechanisms than on the economic history of a region. The boundary of necessary context lies where the addition of new details stops significantly improving the ability to explain events, predict consequences, and make decisions. This means that the same problem may require completely different scales of analysis. An engineer, psychologist, historian, and politician may examine the same event from different perspectives, and each of these perspectives may be useful depending on the purpose of the investigation. Mature thinking does not consist of trying to consider everything simultaneously or searching for the simplest possible answers. It is demonstrated through the ability to choose a level of description that is sufficient for a specific task without creating unnecessary complexity. The limits of understanding are determined not only by the amount of information, but also by the ability to distinguish what is essential from what is secondary. The more accurately a person identifies the necessary context, the more effectively they can interact with reality. Chapter 8: The Collective Production of Meaning. Money, status, and laws as agreements. Human beings live not only among physical objects, but also among phenomena that exist because of collective agreement. A significant part of the surrounding social reality has no independent material substance and is maintained solely because millions of people simultaneously accept certain rules. Money is one of the clearest examples. A paper banknote, a metal coin, or a digital record in a banking system does not contain value by itself. Its meaning exists only because society has agreed to use it as a medium of exchange. The same applies to laws. Text written on paper has no inherent power. It begins to influence behavior only when there is a system of institutions and people willing to recognize its authority and obligation. Status is also a collective construction. Positions, titles, prestige, reputation, and authority do not exist within people themselves, but within the perception of those around them. A CEO, professor, or president is not physically different from other people. Their special position is created by a network of social expectations and agreements. Many elements of human civilization resemble a vast system of mutual interpretations. People interact daily not only with the material world, but also with countless symbolic structures that gain power through collective belief in their existence. How societies maintain shared interpretations. For complex social systems to exist, it is not enough to agree once on the meaning of certain symbols. Every society must constantly reproduce and reinforce its interpretations. One of the primary tools of this process is language. Through words, people acquire ideas about good and evil, acceptable and unacceptable behavior, status, obligations, and values. Language does not merely describe the world, it establishes the boundaries of how that world can be understood. Family, education, religion, mass media, and cultural traditions also play an equally important role. From early childhood, people absorb numerous rules that eventually come to be perceived as a natural part of reality. Schools explain history and the structure of society. Government institutions determine which norms are considered mandatory. Holidays, symbols, and rituals strengthen a sense of belonging to a particular group. Even everyday habits silently reinforce existing interpretations of the world. Collective interpretations are highly stable precisely because they are embedded into multiple social mechanisms simultaneously. People rarely notice how strongly their perception depends on their environment because most people around them share the same assumptions. Social reality exists as long as a sufficient number of people continue to act as if it were objective. Why different civilizations create different realities. If the meaning of things were embedded within nature itself, all human societies would have to arrive at the same conclusions. However, history demonstrates the opposite. Different civilizations have created different systems of values, forms of government, concepts of justice, and models of organizing life. Some societies were built around religious institutions, others around military power, and others around trade or individual freedom. Different cultures have understood family, property, duty, honor, and responsibility in different ways. The reason for these differences lies not in the existence of multiple physical realities, but in the fact that different communities interpret the same reality in different ways. Geography, climate, technology, demographics, wars, and historical events gradually shape unique forms of collective thinking. An inhabitant of an ancient city, a medieval peasant, and a modern engineer live on the same planet and are governed by the same laws of nature. Yet their internal pictures of the world may differ so dramatically that they appear to exist in different universes. Each civilization creates its own set of answers to fundamental questions. What should be considered valuable? Who should hold power? What one should live for? And how one should interact with the surrounding world. This does not mean that all interpretations are equally accurate or equally effective. However, it demonstrates that a significant part of human reality does not emerge from physical laws, but from the collective ability to create, maintain, and transmit systems of meaning. Chapter 9. The Conflict of Interpretations. The Struggle of Ideologies and Systems of Values. If people perceived the world in the same way, most social conflicts simply would not exist. However, different groups form different ideas about what should be considered fair, correct, beneficial, or dangerous. As a result, human history largely becomes a history of clashes between interpretations. Ideologies, religions, political doctrines, and moral systems provide people with ready-made answers to fundamental questions: how society should be organized, what should be considered success, who should hold power, and what is worth living for. Each of these systems creates its own picture of the world, in which certain phenomena are declared valuable while others are considered undesirable. At the same time, conflict does not arise only between large-scale ideologies. It exists at nearly every level of human life. Disagreements between generations, political parties, social groups, and even members of the same family often turn out to be clashes between different ways of interpreting the same events. An economic crisis may be perceived as the result of government mistakes, market imperfections, moral decline within society, or broader historical processes. Each explanation will appear convincing to those whose system of values emphasizes precisely those factors. The struggle of ideas rarely comes down to a dispute over facts. More often, people argue about which facts should be considered the most important, which goals should be prioritized, and through which frame of reference the world should be viewed. Why people defend their worldviews. From the outside, it may seem strange how emotionally people react to criticism of their own beliefs. However, a worldview performs a much more important function than simply explaining the surrounding reality. Any system of beliefs helps a person navigate the world. It answers questions about whom to trust, what to fear, what to strive for, and how to evaluate events. The longer a person lives within a particular model, the more their identity, social connections, and life decisions begin to depend on its stability. Changing one's views often requires reconsidering a significant part of one's own experience. If a familiar system of interpretation turns out to be incorrect, a person must redefine their place in society, reconsider relationships with others, and acknowledge that many previous decisions may have been based on false assumptions. Furthermore, beliefs rarely exist in isolation. They are connected with belonging to certain groups: family, nation, profession, religious community, or political movement. By defending their views, people often defend not only ideas, but also their own identity and position within a collective. For this reason, people are capable of ignoring inconvenient facts, seeking confirmation of existing beliefs, and resisting information that threatens their familiar picture of the world. Many conflicts arise not because one side completely lacks logic, but because each side is defending the system of interpretations upon which its internal and social stability is built. Power as the ability to impose context. Power manifests itself not only through the ability to create laws, control resources, or use force. One of the most significant forms of power is the ability to determine how people understand what is happening. Those who define the context largely influence the conclusions that follow from it. Describing a military conflict as a struggle for freedom, a defense of security, or a pursuit of economic interests can radically change society's attitude toward the same events. Mass media, educational institutions, political structures, religious organizations, and cultural traditions all participate in shaping collective interpretations. They do not simply transmit information, they determine which topics should be considered important, which questions should be asked, and which explanations should be regarded as acceptable. Control over context is often more effective than direct coercion. A person convinced of the correctness of a particular worldview will independently support the existing system without feeling external pressure. This is why the struggle for influence increasingly takes place not only in the spheres of economics and politics, but also in the space of meaning. What competes are not only states and corporations, but also different ways of explaining reality. The ability to impose context does not mean complete control over human thought. However, those who define the language of discussion, the boundaries of acceptable interpretations, and the criteria for evaluating events gain one of the most powerful tools for influencing society. Chapter 10: Intelligence as the ability to switch between models. Why a universal interpretation is impossible. The desire to find a single explanation of the world has accompanied humanity throughout its entire history. People have created religious systems, philosophical concepts, and scientific theories in the hope of discovering a universal principle capable of explaining everything that exists. However, as knowledge accumulated, it became increasingly clear that reality is too complex for a single interpretation. Every model of the world is created to solve a particular class of problems. Physics successfully describes the movement of planets, but says almost nothing about love, art, or politics. Biology explains the origins of emotions, yet cannot independently determine which laws a state should adopt. Economics helps analyze the distribution of resources, but does not answer the question of the meaning of life. Attempts to transform one system of explanation into a universal key for understanding the world inevitably encounter limitations. Complex phenomena emerge at the intersection of many processes operating simultaneously at different levels. A human being can be described as a collection of atoms, a biological organism, a personality, a participant in social relationships, and an element of an economic system. None of these descriptions is false, but none of them is complete. The impossibility of a universal interpretation does not mean that the world is chaotic or unknowable. It only demonstrates that every understanding depends on goals, the scale of analysis, and the questions a person asks. Intelligence lies not in possessing a final picture of the world, but in the ability to choose the appropriate model for a specific situation. Cognitive flexibility as the primary intellectual skill. In many cultures, intelligence has traditionally been associated with the amount of knowledge, speed of calculation, or the ability to memorize information. However, in a complex and constantly changing world, another ability is becoming increasingly important: cognitive flexibility. Flexibility of thinking is expressed through the ability to change interpretations of events, reconsider one's own assumptions, and adapt to new information. A person with a high level of cognitive flexibility is not attached to a single explanatory system and is capable of viewing a problem from multiple perspectives. This ability is especially important because most mistakes arise not from a lack of intelligence, but from excessive attachment to familiar models. People often continue using explanations that were useful in the past, but have ceased to correspond to changed circumstances. Flexible thinking does not mean abandoning all beliefs or endlessly doubting everything. It means being willing to temporarily abandon a convenient interpretation in favor of a more accurate model when new facts require such revision. It is precisely the ability to switch between different ways of understanding that allows people to master new fields of knowledge, interact with those who hold different perspectives, and find solutions in situations where standard approaches are insufficient. In a world where the amount of information grows faster than the ability to absorb it, Intellectual advantage is increasingly determined not by the volume of accumulated knowledge, but by the ability to change one's way of thinking at the right moment. The ability to change the scale of analysis. Any event can be examined from different distances. Just as a map can show a street, a city, or an entire continent, human thinking can shift between different levels of analysis. In everyday life, people often become trapped within a single scale. Some tend to explain everything exclusively through the personal qualities of individuals, while others focus only on broad social processes. As a result, complex phenomena are either excessively simplified or lost in an endless number of details. Yet understanding requires the ability to move freely between levels of description. An employee's problems can be analyzed through their motivation and psychological state. One can examine the structure of the company where they work. One can study the state of the economy or changes in the labor market. Each of these scales reveals different patterns. The same applies to history, politics, culture, and even personal life. Failure may result from a specific decision, the influence of social environment, biological limitations, or a random combination of circumstances. The more complex the system, the more important the ability to shift between different levels of analysis becomes. Intelligence is not demonstrated by the desire to find the one correct scale, but by understanding which scale is most useful at a particular moment. A person begins to navigate the world more effectively not when they obtain final answers, but when they learn to freely change the ways they describe reality without accepting any single description as absolute truth. Chapter 11. Searching for the most effective interpretation. Predictive power as a criterion of quality. If it is impossible to obtain a completely objective picture of the world, the question arises, how can we distinguish a good interpretation from a poor one? One of the most reliable criteria is its ability to predict events. An explanation gains value not when it merely seems convincing, but when it allows us to anticipate what will happen under certain conditions. This is why scientific theories are valued not for the beauty of their formulations, but for their ability to make testable predictions. Human beings constantly use this principle without even realizing it. They expect the sun to rise in the morning, a familiar route to lead them to the desired destination, and certain actions to produce predictable reactions from others. Everyday life is built upon the continuous testing of internal models of the world. Predictive power does not require absolute accuracy. Every complex system contains an element of uncertainty. However, a high-quality interpretation should increase the probability of making correct predictions compared with random guessing. A theory that can equally easily explain any possible outcome gradually loses its value. If an explanation works regardless of the result, it ceases to explain anything. For this reason, the most useful models of the world do not merely describe why something has already happened. They help us understand which consequences are most likely to occur in the future. The balance between simplicity and completeness. Every interpretation must find a compromise between two opposing requirements. On one hand, a model must be simple enough for people to use. On the other hand, it must be complete enough to account for the essential characteristics of reality. Excessive simplification creates an illusion of understanding. Complex social processes begin to be explained by a single cause. Human behavior is reduced to a few personality traits, and historical events are presented as inevitable consequences of one determining factor. However, the opposite extreme is also dangerous. A model containing an infinite number of details becomes practically useless. If every decision requires considering thousands of variables, the ability to act gradually disappears. An effective interpretation resembles a good map. It does not completely copy the territory, but preserves only the information necessary for a specific task. The search for a balance between simplicity and completeness never reaches a final solution. As new knowledge appears, models are constantly revised, expanded, or, conversely, simplified. Intelligence is not demonstrated by choosing between simplicity and complexity, but by the ability to determine what level of detail is actually necessary. How to test your own explanations. One of the main problems of human thinking is the tendency to defend existing beliefs. People naturally notice facts that confirm their assumptions and are much less receptive to information that contradicts them. Therefore, the search for effective interpretations requires not only creating new explanations, but also constantly testing existing ones. The first question that should be asked of any model is simple. What exactly does it allow us to predict? If an interpretation does not change our expectations about future events, its practical value is limited. The second important question concerns alternatives. There are almost always several ways to explain the same phenomenon. Comparing competing models allows us to see the limitations of each one and avoid the trap of a single perspective. The third criterion is resistance to new data. A good model does not collapse when encountering exceptions, but neither does it ignore them. It is capable of changing while maintaining its ability to describe reality. Finally, it is useful to ask ourselves about the boundaries of our own interpretations. Under what conditions does it work? Which factors does it fail to consider? Where does its area of applicability end? Understanding the world does not begin with confidence in one's own correctness, but with recognizing that every picture of reality is a temporary construction. The most effective interpretations are not those that claim absolute truth, but those that remain open to testing, revision, and expansion of context. Chapter 12. Conclusion. Meaning as a function of context. The world does not provide humans with ready-made answers. Human beings are born into a world that contains no built-in instructions for understanding itself. Nature does not explain what should be considered justice, success, or the meaning of life. The universe does not reveal which goals are correct and which are mistaken. All of these concepts emerge within human interpretations. Throughout history, people have created religions, philosophical systems, scientific theories, and social institutions in an attempt to transform the chaotic flow of events into a comprehensible picture of the world. Each generation inherited existing explanations while simultaneously adding its own interpretations. However, no system of beliefs emerges directly from reality itself. Between the external world and human understanding, there is always a layer of language, culture, biology, history, and personal experience. Human beings do not live among ready-made answers, but among attempts to create them. This does not make the search for meaning meaningless. On the contrary, it is precisely the absence of predetermined explanations that turns understanding the world into a continuous process of building increasingly effective models. Every picture of reality is a model. No matter how convincing a person's beliefs may appear, they always remain only one way of organizing experience. Any theory, ideology, scientific concept, or value system is a model that helps navigate the world, but it does not become the world itself. Even the most successful scientific descriptions are not final truths. They exist as long as they allow us to explain what is happening and predict new phenomena. When more accurate models emerge, previous interpretations are modified or replaced. The same process occurs in everyday life. Ideas about oneself, other people, society, morality, justice, and freedom are constantly revised under the influence of new experiences and changing circumstances. Recognizing that every picture of reality is a model does not destroy knowledge. It makes knowledge more flexible. A person stops treating their own beliefs as absolute and begins to see them as tools with certain limits of applicability. The world is far more complex than any description of it, and therefore no interpretation can claim to be final. Understanding begins where certainty in a single correct interpretation ends. One of the main characteristics of human thinking is the tendency to transform one's own perspective into a universal truth. People want to believe that their system of values, political views, moral principles, or scientific ideas reflects the world exactly as it truly is. However, the broader the context becomes, the more difficult it is to maintain such certainty. History shows that many ideas that once appeared obvious and unquestionable have changed or disappeared over time. Some interpretations have been replaced by others that are more accurate, more flexible, or better adapted to new conditions. Understanding does not begin when a person discovers a final answer, but when they begin to recognize the limitations of their own explanations. The ability to question familiar models, compare different frames of reference, and revise one's understanding becomes one of the most important tools of knowledge. This does not mean that all interpretations are equally good or that truth is impossible to reach. Some models truly prove to be more useful than others. They predict events more accurately, encompass a broader context, and allow more effective interaction with reality. But the deeper a person studies the world, the clearer one idea becomes. Meaning is not contained within things themselves. It emerges at the intersection of the observer, the environment, history, culture, and the chosen scale of analysis. And perhaps it is precisely the ability to freely change this scale that makes understanding itself possible.